anytime there's a conversation about fertility, it almost always focuses on the women, and there's very little emphasis on the man. And we need to bring both into the conversation, which is why we address both in Real Food for Fertility. So hopefully this becomes a resource that couples are using together, working on really arguably a lot of the same diet and lifestyle choices together as a team to set the stage for a healthier pregnancy ahead.
Getting pregnant and giving birth are two of the most exciting things you can ever hope to experience in this life. The moment you think you could be pregnant, you're frantically searching for all the best information, which is why you're here today. I'm Stephanie King, and with my many years of experience as a professional childbirth educator, doula, and lover of all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, I'm here to make preparing for your birth enjoyable, empowering, and totally easy. Each week, I'll cover different topics, interview professionals, and get into the nitty-gritty birth stories from mamas just like you. And when you're ready for more, you can join me in the My Essential Birth course at myessentialbirth.com, where I take you step by step through exactly how to prepare your mind, body, spirit, and partner for a birth you love. So let's get started. This week, you guys, I'm so excited to say that we have back Lily Nichols. Lily Nichols is a registered dietitian and nutritionist. She's a certified diabetes educator, researcher, and author with a passion for evidence-based prenatal nutrition. Her work is known for being research-focused, thorough, and critical of outdated dietary guidelines. She is the founder of the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition, co-founder of the Women's Health Nutrition Academy, and the author of 3 books: Real Food for Fertility, co-authored with Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, Real Food for Pregnancy, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Lily's best-selling books have helped tens of thousands of mamas and babies and are used at university-level maternal nutrition and midwifery courses, and have even influenced prenatal nutrition policy internationally. So obviously, we are very blessed to be able to have her back with us today. And as I was sharing with her prior to having her jump on, everything that she has written in her books, I feel like I'm a little obsessed with what she has researched and what she's put together. Everything that's in there has been included in course updates or things that I talk about even on social media and stuff. This is all like very relevant, very important information for mamas to have. And I'm excited to talk about preconception today because this is everything leading up to what you guys are working on right now. And I know there are many listeners that you're trying to conceive as we speak. So with that, Lily, welcome to the show. And if you would, maybe take a moment, say a little about yourself, anything that I didn't include, and then I want to dive into preconception.
Sure thing. Yeah, thank you for having me back. I think you've given a pretty good intro. Obviously, by the topics that my books have covered, I really focus on nutrition for the childbearing years, preconception, pregnancy, postpartum. And yeah, I think a lot of my work at the moment is focusing on really looking deeply into how our pregnancy guidelines or nutrition guidelines as a whole were set, like evaluating the quality of the evidence, looking at what new information has come out since that have, not yet been updated. I mean, people are kind of shocked when I tell them that, the micronutrient guidelines for pregnancy, for example, have not been significantly overhauled since the late 90s, early 2000s. So we have, 20, 25 years of new research that have yet to be incorporated. So, my goal is to empower families with more information to make more like optimal nutrition choices so they can have easier conception journeys, pregnancies, postpartum recovery, breastfeeding journey. Like all of that has at least some degree of relation to what you're eating. So that's really my focus.
Yeah, I'm super grateful for your work. The book that you wrote that is kind of the basis for our conversation today, and for those who are listening, is called Real Food for Fertility. And I feel like, it's nice and thick. There is tons of information in there. There's a big chunk about food. It talks about menstruation and your eggs and all kinds of really, really great information. But that's where I want to head today, and I'm so excited about it. So kind of with that, maybe let's just dive into a couple questions, and one of which has to do with Well, and I feel like there are so many like good nuggets that I want to pull in because there were these things that I didn't know, for example, that 220 days before you're ever going to touch that egg or that egg's going to come through, there's a lot of things happening to build that egg and stuff. So let's talk a little bit about all the work we do before. Why is it even important to think about preconception nutrition?
Yeah. So, what you're alluding to, that 220 days is like the amount of time we need to go back from like the date of ovulation to when that egg was first recruited as an underdeveloped ovarian follicle. So it's a long journey, 7 to 8 months. Essentially, everything that we're doing in that time frame, and arguably even before that, has some influence on our egg quality, has some influence on our hormone production and overall hormone balance, our thyroid health, our glucose regulation. All of these things play a role in our fertility and our chances of conception. So we really do need to be kind of thinking ahead in an ideal world, if you have, the luxury of planning a pregnancy, to be thinking about like how can we support our optimal health in the months and years leading up to ovulation, because ultimately, again, the quality of that egg is affected by all of this. Not only that, but the quality of your endometrial lining, which is the first home for a fertilized egg, and that's going to be where it implants, that's going to be where the placenta forms and embeds into the uterine wall. If that endometrium is not sufficiently thick due to things like low hormone production or nutritional deficiencies or other factors, there's less of a chance that implantation will be successful. There's a greater chance that things with placental development will go wrong. And issues with the placental development really underscore the majority of major pregnancy complications, because that's how the fetus is getting nutrients, exchanging hormones, waste products, like all the things are related to the health of the placenta. The health of the baby is the health of the placenta. So it really is kind of like a full spectrum view at reproduction. We also need to think about, the partner's health too. Sperm quality plays a role in the health of a pregnancy. The chances it's successful plays a major role in the formation of a healthy placenta as well. So we really need to be thinking about both partners. Like anytime there's a conversation about fertility, it almost always focuses on the women, and there's very little emphasis on the man. And we need to bring both into the conversation, which is why we address both in Real Food for Fertility. So hopefully this becomes a resource that couples are using together, working on really arguably a lot of the same diet and lifestyle choices together as a team to set the stage for a healthier pregnancy ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. It is totally mostly on the women when it comes to fertility until it's like, okay, everything checks out with mom. Now let's look at dad. Where it really should be, working on that from the beginning together. I agree with that. So, with that in mind, and kind of saying, yes, it takes a long time for this little egg to make its trip or start forming and all that stuff. How much time, or how much before you're looking to conceive, how long before should you really be paying attention to your nutrition?
So we talked about that, 7 to 8 month window. That would be like an ideal amount of time to spend if you can. The most sensitive period for the effects of nutrients and toxin exposure and things like that on egg quality is in the last 3 or so months right before ovulation. And there's an approximately 3 months, a little less than 3 months, 70 something days for sperm development. So those 3 months prior are really the most crucial. Whether you need to be really on top of it for a longer period of time, like giving yourself a longer runway, so to speak, to conception, depends on what's going on with your health. So, are there hormonal imbalances? Is your cycle regular or not? Like, is there polycystic ovarian syndrome, hypothalamic amenorrhea going on? Have you been on hormonal birth control for a long period of time? By design, that shuts down ovarian hormone production and ovulation. So there is a longer period of time that your body needs to restore ovarian function and thus regular ovulation. So you might need a longer run up, especially if you were on hormonal contraceptives for a really long period of time, or were put on them for cycle issues. I mean, people are put on them for cycle issues as if it's going to fix the cycle issue. It doesn't fix the cycle issue. It just gives you a fake pill bleed that makes you think that you're having regular cycles. Those are, anovulatory hormonal contraceptive withdrawal bleeds. Like you're bleeding because you have like the sugar pills for a week. Um, and so when those women who are on them for cycle issues come off, a lot of times they find the cycle issues remain, right? So those still need to be addressed after the fact. And those women especially need potentially a longer run up to pregnancy than somebody who had a totally normal cycle and just went on hormonal contraceptives purely from the standpoint of having a form of birth control. They might be more likely to resume normal ovulation quicker. I would also say, like, in the realm of health issues that might make you want to have a longer time preparing, gut issues, autoimmune issues, thyroid issues, all of those can impact reproductive health as well. So those might need a little bit more time to be addressed before you start. So a lot of it really has to do with like how far ahead are you planning? What's your baseline health? Um, and how much time can you put to this? Like there's no downside in just eating in a way and living your life in a way that you're optimally healthy. But if you're not living that way naturally, like the sooner you start implementing that prior to conception, the better. There's no downsides, to have a longer time.
Yeah. How about kind of like our modern lifestyle and maybe even specific to like insulin and sugar and diet and things that we do? I feel like, and you kind of go over this in your book, but certainly, today here in the United States, I feel like we are raising and have grown up as one of the least healthy generations in the way of what we put into our bodies and specifically the amount of sugar that we eat. And I too am guilty of this. I feel like nobody is immune, and all these processed fun foods like cereals and Pop Tarts and all this, other stuff that it is readily available and projected to the kids to be this like fun thing. And I don't know, I just feel like it's such a part of our diet. Or even me a couple years ago, and I'm trying to eat healthy, and it's like all the whole grain breads and all the whole grain pastas and all this stuff, not realizing what I'm doing to my blood sugar in my body. Can you kind of talk about that for a minute, and maybe ways that we can help mitigate that, or what it really looks like to be on a real food diet when we are planning, well, just in life, not even just planning, but also this would include preconception.
Yeah. So, you do want to think about your blood sugar stability, how variable it is after eating between meals overnight. Like all of this can play a role in your egg quality and your hormone balance, levels of inflammation in your body as well. And it is beyond just like the people who have overt diabetes. Obviously, that has a very dramatic effect on fertility when blood sugar is not well controlled. But even in women whose blood sugar is just at the higher end of the so-called normal range, they experience delays in conception. So it's really, we want to be looking at like what are optimal blood sugar levels and how can we achieve this. So once upon a time earlier in my career, I did a lot more education around like reducing refined carbohydrates and added sugars and processed foods. And like we have to reduce those. And I've shifted my focus in recent years, I guess older and wiser. Instead of talking about all the things to avoid, and I mean, I do discuss that in the book, of course, like it has to be said. When I'm actually like working with a client, my focus is on what are we trying to eat more of to achieve blood sugar balance. And so I really try to help people consume an adequate amount of protein, high quality protein. That means primarily coming from animal foods, by the way, although I'm not anti-plant proteins. Legumes can be absolutely fabulous for, fertility and satiety and everything. But when it comes to protein quality, we're really looking at a significant amount of animal proteins coming into the diet. And when we achieve that, we achieve blood sugar balance. Like it's just like almost an automatic side effect of consuming an adequate amount of protein. You do not have the hunger or appetite for a ton of carbohydrates. And your blood sugar stays so much more stable between meals that you don't experience a rapid drop in your blood sugar that triggers a physiological response that tells your body it wants carbs to raise your blood sugar back up. It's not a willpower thing, although they do make processed foods intentionally addictive. Okay. Like that's also a thing. The food industry really does make foods, they design them to make you want to eat more of them because obviously that's how they sell more food. But we can interrupt that by consuming an adequate amount of protein. Then, when we don't experience that massive blood sugar dip, instead of feeling like, oh my gosh, I have to get my hands on like a donut or a coffee or something that's going to be a pick me up, usually carbs, sugar, or caffeine, you will simply feel like your hunger start to gradually grow over time as you get closer to a mealtime, where you're not like dying to have a snack, but you're like, I'm kind of hungry. I need to eat soon. And like, if it's in 20 minutes or if it's in an hour, it doesn't really matter to your body because your blood sugar is staying pretty even keeled. Like you ate enough high quality fuel that's keeping you stable. So that's really the main place nowadays that I tend to focus because it is the more effective intervention. When people are eating enough protein, they are naturally eating less processed foods. It's just like basically, a guarantee. Of course, I also like to emphasize including more like fresh vegetables, especially our lower starch vegetables. Mainly all of our greens would fall into that category. And for the carbs that you are having with a meal, because I'm not anti-carb, and that's, something I think people, unless you've read my work where I go into all of the nuances and details, people will make all sorts of assumptions. I'm not anti-carb, but we do need to also think about the quality of carbohydrates we're consuming. So, you alluded to whole grains, and, I've got nothing against whole grains, but the quantity at which our dietary guidelines tell us to eat whole grains is excessive. Like the guidelines are excessive in carbohydrates, they are inadequate in protein, and they are inadequate in fat. So we need to not only think about like what we're eating, quality wise, but also think about like the macronutrient balance of our diets. So if we're making like, yes, a whole grain is going to be like a more nutritious choice than a refined grain, something made with white flour. At the end of the day, like the blood sugar response to a giant bowl of whole wheat spaghetti is going to be really similar to a giant bowl of regular spaghetti. You're getting like a couple extra grams of fiber and you're getting some B vitamins in there. And that's great. And I'm not anti pasta by any means, but what would be ideal is regardless of which pasta you choose, it becomes more of like a small side dish at a meal instead of like the center stage of your plate. And a lot of the way that people eat is that the carbs, the grains, the potatoes, and I'm not anti potatoes, I love potatoes, but like they take up the bulk of the plate instead of being a side dish. And they really should be eaten in side dish quantities. There are some exceptions. Athletes, for example, that have super high energy needs and might be burning through a heck of a lot of carbs, like they can handle more. But for the average person, having your carbs is maybe like a quarter of your plate, and having a solid portion of protein and vegetables on the other parts of your plate, that is a easier way to achieve blood sugar balance than having it in the reverse, where you have a huge portion of carbs, a little bit of protein, a little bit of vegetable.
Yeah. Will you talk about protein requirements or what you believe is a really good, healthy, safe guideline for women?
Yeah. So in order to talk about it, I have to talk about the guidelines first. So you have some comparison here. So, currently our recommended dietary allowance is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. Why do they calculate it in kilograms instead of pounds when the US doesn't use the metric system widely? That's beyond me, but that's how they calculate it. Okay. So for like a typical adult woman, that's going to be like 45, 55, 60, grams or so of protein per day. This equates to maybe 10% of your calories coming from protein. It's a really, really low benchmark. And we have other widely accepted US dietary guidelines that say you could eat upwards of 35% of your calories from protein and still have a balanced diet. But when you look at any conventional meal plan or recommendations, they're always diverting down to maybe 10 or 15% of calories from protein. It's not enough. It is set at a bare minimum level for human survival to maintain nitrogen balance in your body and virtually nothing else. It is really low level. We have decades now of research accumulated from protein researchers showing that we actually need a lot more protein. So Bare minimum is probably more like 1.2 grams per kilo. Optimal is debated anywhere from 1.5 to 2.2 grams per kilo. At 2.2 grams per kilo, that's about a gram of protein per pound of body weight, or per pound of ideal weight, and a weight that's typical for your height. Um, and so that's a lot more protein. I mean, more than double what is in our current recommendations. And I find most women thrive at that level, especially women who are more active. So you have more protein turnover from your exercise and repairing your muscles and tendons and ligaments and all that. They need even more protein. And then, of course, during pregnancy, you need to emphasize protein even more. And in postpartum, especially in nursing moms, you need even more than a typical female athlete.
And so, for somebody who's trying to get this protein, and it sounds because you do talk about the plate method, and we actually talked about that on the podcast last time too. But you're kind of like, make a quarter of your plate protein, a quarter of your plate those good, healthy carbs. Am I doing this right? The other half vegetables. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So with that, would you say like, because this is my recommendation, because I know that's how it works for me, is I try to eat my protein first. Would that be your recommendation for moms, even with the plate method, or does it matter? Is it just a matter of making sure you get the protein?
So if somebody has some pretty significant blood sugar imbalances, you might want to zero in on the order in which you eat foods, because you do lower your blood sugar. Your like blood sugar response to a meal will be lower, maybe like 30 to 40% lower. It depends on the research study you're looking at. If you consume your protein or vegetables first and consume the carbohydrate starchy portion last. So for somebody with like polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, they can really benefit from the meal ordering thing, because there's often blood sugar and insulin imbalances present in those women. A regular person, like it's great to have like slightly lower blood sugar, but it doesn't make or break the like ultimate nutrient intake, and isn't really going to make or break the glucose response. I mean, I've worn a continuous glucose monitor many times as like using myself as a lab rat. And if it is a really high glycemic carbohydrate, like, uh, candy, or people will argue that it's low glycemic, but dates are like really big. They spike your blood sugar a lot. I'll have a massive blood sugar response if I only eat dates. But if I eat dates with protein, it's slightly less. If I eat dates after a protein rich meal, I can almost avoid a blood sugar spike whatsoever. It's much, much lower when it's consumed after. But for something like, I don't know, for my body personally, my homemade sourdough bread, which is like a long fermented sourdough, doesn't really spike my blood sugar much. I know not everybody has that response. Like it's an individual thing. So for me, like if I'm going to have eggs with sourdough and butter, for breakfast, if I want to have my toast first, like it doesn't really make a difference at the end of the day for that one. But for like dessert, certainly like saving your dessert for after your protein rich meal, that really can make a dramatic difference. So I think like whether you zero in on the ordering has to do with your underlying, health and blood sugar imbalance, and then probably what you're actually having at the meal. The the treats or indulgences, maybe if you save those after a meal, that's a better option for blood sugar levels than having those treats on an empty stomach or as a snack.
Okay, this is kind of like a squirrel comment, but I'm bringing it up because you brought up the dates. And I was reading that in your book where you talked about it wasn't dates, but you were talking about when you have this high amount of sugar, how it constricts the blood vessels and actually has your body create prostaglandins. And this is like a totally curious, like me being a part of birth question, where we have this study on dates that say if you eat 6 of this size of date, 6 weeks prior to giving birth, it's actually shown your cervix to be more soft. It helps ripen your cervix. And I thought that is so interesting that dates would spike your blood sugar and create prostaglandins, and prostaglandins are what we know to soften a cervix. So then it had me like asking the question though, is it worth it? And we know there are other ways to soften a cervix, right? We can insert evening primrose oil or some other things that are done with the care of a medical provider. There are other like herbs or other things that can happen. So can I ask you that question? And I would just love to hear what your thoughts on that are, because this is something that I've definitely talked about. And even, I mean, I have it as an encouragement. Like if you're looking to do something, having nothing to do with the blood sugar side of things, though, which I think is actually really important. And obviously, moms with gestational diabetes can't do it.
Yeah, I get this question a lot, and you may not have seen it, but I do have a pretty in-depth article on eating dates for labor and looking at the blood sugar response. And I use myself as a guinea pig. Granted, full disclosure, I was not pregnant when I was doing these date things, although I did test out six, I believe it was 6 dates alone on an empty stomach while I was pregnant while wearing a CGM. And I do write about that as well. It was not pretty, by the way. Um, so ultimately with the date stuff, the research is kind of all over the map, like whether it's beneficial or not. It's kind of, it depends on the study. Um, I went really in depth on the studies that are done on it, and there's a pretty significant amount of bias in the research papers, especially because uh, there's like a religious practice of consuming dates. So there's, and a lot of times these studies are coming from areas where the researchers are, people who practice that religion. So I think that has something to do with the amount of bias in some of the studies. Not all of them have bore out exactly the same results as one or the other. So I do my best to give a review of that research on there, and then I go into, as I kind of just alluded to, on the like order in which you consume them. If you're going to choose to consume dates, like do it in this manner so that you avoid a blood sugar response, a significant blood sugar response. So, to put it simply, eating 6 dates all by itself on an empty stomach, I think, is a terrible idea. um, and I could see firsthand in my blood sugar response, it was really disastrous. But if you were to break up those dates and have maybe 2 after each meal, and those, you've maybe been kind of conscious of what the makeup of your meal is, so you're not eating like a huge pasta meal and then having dates, but you're having like a high protein, lower carb meal, and then the dates are like the carbs, you're simply consuming them as a dessert, that you probably aren't going to experience a significant blood sugar spike unless you're somebody very, very sensitive to carbs, like someone with gestational diabetes. You're going to have to test it out and see what your glycemic response is. And it's a little tricky if you're just doing like a finger prick every once in a while to see what's going on. Like you kind of have to have a continuous glucose monitor to see the spike, because sometimes you're spiking at 30 minutes or 45 minutes after consuming, and then you crash after. So people will be like, oh, my blood sugar is great after eating dates. It's like, well, you happened to test when right before you were like bottoming out, crashing. So your blood sugar came out at 85. That's fantastic. But then you went down to like 55. And this happened after you spiked to 170. So it really is something that you want to just test what your response to them is my recommendation. I don't know. I'm also of the belief that like our bodies just, labor happens when it happens. I did not consume dates in either of my pregnancies and had, uncomplicated home births, no induction or anything like that. So, I think if you trust your body to actually be able to birth your baby, like it'll happen when it is time to happen. I don't know that dates are really like that big of a lever pusher, because we like to think we're like completely in control of all the things. And, it's not always up to us exactly when and how birth is going to unfold, right?
No truer words. Yes, totally agree. I am going to go dig onto your website and find that. And for those who are listening, if you're curious, I will make sure to have it in the show notes. I love that. No, that's the fun part about reading new information, or just, stuff that's been detailed, is like all the thoughts that it just brings it all together. And you're like, oh, I'm so curious about the workings of the body and how women give birth. And it's just incredible. So, okay, I do kind of bringing it back. You had talked about carbs and starchy stuff and all that kind of thing. And you had kind of mentioned, people think I'm a no carb person. How about for moms who are interested in no carb? Is there any danger in only eating protein and fat prior to getting pregnant and also throughout pregnancy?
So this is something where you're going to just have strong opinions in either direction. I know personally people who have consumed a carnivore diet leading up to pregnancy and followed even pretty closely to carnivore during pregnancy and had perfectly fine outcomes. Does that mean it is necessarily optimal or is the right choice for everybody? Absolutely not. I personally like to see people eating the widest variety of foods possible that their body can handle without experiencing really adverse symptoms or health outcomes. So there are rare instances where somebody might feel best on a carnivore diet. I think most people, at least for, when it comes to long-term health, do better with a little more variety in there. There are considerations with certain micronutrients when you're eating really, really low carb. Like, I usually don't like people going below maybe 75 grams or so of carbs during pregnancy. It starts to open up this kind of Pandora's box of different micronutrient deficiencies. Yes, meat and animal protein are really the most nutrient dense foods on the planet, but there are certain nutrients, there are a selection of nutrients that are more concentrated in plants than there are in animals. And even when you look, globally at ancestral diets, even when you go to areas that eat a more carnivore heavy, even borderline or totally ketogenic diet, like in the far north, right, where you're like hunting sea mammals and caribou and whatever for your food, and there's no plants growing in the winter and it's a really long winter. What's interesting is when you dive into some of those like traditional Alaskan, Inuit practices, they were gathering lots of berries in the summer and preserving them in seal oil. They might even be consuming the contents of the digestive tract of, that animal. Like, they may have gathered a whole bunch of different roots and tubers from wild plants that grow in the area, and those have been preserved and kept for winter. Even though the proportion of their diet coming from carbs is low, they're not entirely absent, and there are some nutrients that they are kind of filling the gaps for with those particular foods. I do also think that people get all up in arms about fiber, whether it's essential, whether it's not. What I have seen in clients who do like long-term full carnivore diets is they do end up having some challenges down the line. There can be challenges with hormonal balance. We need fiber to help bind to our bile acids, and bile carries toxins that we're excreting, used up hormones that our body doesn't want anymore. Fiber binds those and helps those get excreted through your stool. That plays a role. Fiber helps to feed your microbiome, which affects the creation and absorption of certain nutrients, your immune health. A whole bunch of things are related to our microbiome. And even if you're not like eating a super high fiber diet, having some makes sense. And when you're looking at, the most nutrient dense plant foods, you're often looking at the ones that also consume a decent amount of fiber. So I think there's a role for, a little bit of both, but I'm not going to say outright anybody who follows carnivore, it's like purely dangerous. I would definitely want them to be on a, comprehensive prenatal vitamin to fill in potential nutrient gaps, and, just keep an eye on how baby's growth is. I mean, carbs are anabolic. They help us grow, and our body is actively trying to not only grow a new human, but you're trying to accrue and store body fat in preparation for, postpartum and breastfeeding, where you start using that body fat to fuel your milk production. So if somebody is doing this diet and they're maybe not feeling well, or they're not gaining enough weight, or baby's growth is lagging, I would be recommending that they liberalize their diet and start including some more plant foods, some more carbs in there.
How about where people are getting their carbs, but also their proteins? Does that matter? And maybe you could talk about that for a moment.
So yeah, so it matters. There's with protein foods, there's different quality of protein and bioavailability of protein. So if we're getting Animal proteins, we're getting complete protein, which has all of the amino acids that our body needs. With plant proteins, you're getting incomplete proteins. They don't have the full spectrum of essential amino acids. They are also missing a number of so-called non-essential amino acids, things that in the past we thought maybe humans don't need these because our body has the metabolic capability to create those amino acids, but there's some new lines of research questioning whether that's truly scientifically sound logic to begin with. So, and we have to remember, even our dietary guidelines that are set at super low levels of protein, there's not like a separate guideline for vegetarians for protein intake, because the assumption was that they were getting half or more of their protein from animal foods, namely dairy products or eggs. So they'd be getting a source of complete protein. And there's been research looking into that now, because you have all these people following so-called plant-based diets or whatever. A lot of them are not even getting half of their protein from animal foods. The way that a vegetarian nowadays eats is a lot different than a vegetarian in like the 80s or 90s. Like, I remember in the 90s, our vegetarian friends were eating like pretty significant amounts of cheese and eggs. There were like egg casserole, quiche type dishes all the time. They were adding cheese to things. And nowadays, more people are leaning into the plant side, and they're not getting enough protein, and certainly not enough high quality protein. So there is some research on that suggesting people who eat more plant-based, they might actually need to aim about 20% higher on their protein requirements. So it does matter where it's coming from. For me, I like to see a mix. I like to see that you're having some animal proteins, widest variety as possible to get the best micronutrient intake, and also including some plant proteins too. Legumes are highly nutrient dense. Those are associated with, good ovulatory function. They're really high in folate, potassium. They have a good amount of fiber. They're a carb source that has a decent amount of protein, so they tend to be pretty low glycemic with their protein and fiber components. So I like to see people getting like a mix instead of getting so dogmatic that they're stuck in there. I'll only eat this, or I'll only eat that. When it comes to carbohydrates, yes, quality counts. The more refined a carbohydrate is, the more you've taken the fiber and other, components of the whole out of it, you're just end up left with a pure starch. So you're left with something that raises your blood sugar a lot, but doesn't have any of the micronutrients that we would expect to see in that food in nature. So like instant mashed potatoes versus a whole potato, like you're getting a different nutritional profile there. White flour versus whole wheat flour, or take it a step further and you've made sourdough with that whole wheat flour, so it's been long fermented. Like, it's a different effect on your body from a blood sugar standpoint, but also a nutrient standpoint. So the more that we can be getting our carbs from whole foods, the better. You're getting the fiber intact, and you're getting the greatest array of vitamins and minerals as well. So whole fruit instead of juice, whole grains instead of refined. You can list like every possible example, like basically trying to minimize the white flour and white sugar being the primary source of carbs, which is tricky. Like in the US, 85% of grains consumed are refined. Like most of the grains people are consuming are in the form of white flour. And, 58% of US calories are coming from ultra processed foods, which have a ton of added sugar. They have the white flour, they have the low quality oils, they have all the chemicals and additives and other things to make what otherwise would taste like cardboard taste like food, even though it's not. You could never recreate an ultra processed food in your kitchen because you can't even like read off the chemical list of ingredients, right? So whichever angle like you want to take that, we kind of arrive at the same place, really.
Yeah. Well, and those foods are cheap and addictive. And so I think this is why what you're doing is so important, though, because even if you, so we did an experiment with our kids, for example, and it came off of a documentary that we watched. It wasn't meant to do this, but we had watched a documentary called Fat Fiction. And so we kind of did what they did in there, which was for 5 days, we had our kids do a ketogenic diet. We're like, you're going to eat a ton of fat and all the protein that you want. And then for 5 days, we're going to eat off of myplate.gov, right? So, and they give you recommended for their age, for their height, for how many calories they should have. And it's things like juices and non-fat chocolate milk and non-fat this and cereals and all this stuff. And you're like, how is this good? And the problem that I'm seeing today is that that's the information when you Google that is out there. And so that is why what you're doing, I think, is so important. And why, I mean, for women who are listening, if you have an opportunity, buy the book, buy her books. Like the information is in there and it's readily available. And now you have people like you who are, so adamant and clear and structured about it because you've done the research. You've got all the research listed within the book too. And you've set it out so clear and so simple. So if women follow this, you will bring health to yourself and future generations through your children. And I think that's just such a big deal because we are stuck, at least how I feel right now, even as a mom, I felt stuck in this, we're spinning around, you're trying to do all the healthy things, but the healthy things aren't working because they're not actually healthy. So anyways, the research that you've done and the information and all that food information, I think is just crucial for where we're at right now. And especially for
Yeah,
women
and
who are
I
having the
would
next
love to hear
generation of
about this
babies.
experiment with your kids.
I think I'm going to have
How
them on
did
the
that play
podcast.
out?
Yeah, I don't put them on social media, but it will be their voices. And I do think I want them to talk about it because one of the things we did, we homeschool. And one of the things that we did was we're like, you guys keep track of how you feel each day. How hungry are you? How tired are you? What's your emotions like? What are your bowels doing? And they did. And in the beginning, because we did the keto one first, day 2, everybody was dying, right? They're getting off sugar. They're getting off all the things, the carbs, all that stuff. And so they're like, I don't feel good and I'm tired and my head hurts and whatever. And by the end of the week, everybody's energy, everybody's mental state, everybody's emotional state, the amount of arguing we had in our home, literally, it had changed everything. Now, they didn't see that until they went on to the next one, which was the myplate.gov. And so we switched that over and we had them do the higher carb and the low fat, whatever, which we didn't even make it the whole week because they're like, I cannot do non-fat anything anymore. You know what I mean? But a couple days into that, and they're like, my head hurts and I don't feel good in a different way. And I'm sluggish and I'm tired and I'm cranky and my stomach hurts. That's a big one. My stomach hurts, or I'm in the bathroom for 30 minutes, And they were like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how much better I felt. Sometimes hindsight's 2020. And so they had this, and so now we're all back to it again. So now they're like, okay, mom, like we want more protein and I don't want to eat this crap anymore. And even coming up to Halloween, it's like, well, we don't want to get sick going to Universal Studios, which we have planned or whatever. And I think that's huge. I think that's a big
Yeah,
deal. So, and I mean, those
teaching
are the
it from
kinds of,
like the mindful eating perspective.
yeah. Yeah. And I hope,
Yeah.
the way that we did it, I hope it's something that sticks with them for the rest of their lives because they've done it and, it's been like it's affected them personally. So, but I that was a big deal for me to see that because I'm like, this is how we're all raising our children and we're doing the best we can. And every mom is trying to do the very best she can for her child. We just don't have the right direction. And so that's, again, where I think your information is so crucial and important right now. So, and I'll include the links for all of her books for you guys that are listening, her website, all that you have tons of, like you were saying, the blogs and blog information and all that stuff. And like I said, all the studies are listed. Once you go down the rabbit hole, and I'm not a nutritionist, I'm not a registered dietitian, anything like that. I am a mom and I care about my own body. And once you get started, you're just reading truth and you're like, oh my gosh, it's all making sense. I get it. And you want to do the right thing. So I hope that's, I assume that's the effect that you have on most people that pick up your work. So yeah, it's important.
I hope so. I mean, I know a lot of what I say, if people listen to me on a podcast, they're like, a lot of it seems like common sense. And what's funny about it is it is, and yet it takes so much. I think when people do not understand just how behind the guidelines are, they don't realize what we're really up against. Like you might have a more health conscious audience. So what I'm saying is all like, well, yeah, obviously the amount of like effort that it takes to dig up the studies that back the case, that like build an argument against these outdated guidelines, it's a huge task. Like it's a huge task. And in that you find some really, really interesting and compelling data. And so I'm kind of the person who compiles the data. Like, here's the proof that this actually works. Ultimately, you have to kind of be your own guinea pig, just like you and your family did, where you try it out. Like, try it out for a couple of days. Like, try out optimizing your protein intake at breakfast and see how you feel. Like try a couple days doing, eggs and bacon and sauteed spinach or something for breakfast. And then try a couple days and just do oatmeal and a banana. Like see how you feel. How's your hunger level? How are your energy levels? How are your bowel movements? Like all of these things, give us really direct and nearly immediate feedback on whether or not the guidelines really work or not. It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, well, and it's like you said, and these things exist. The sad part is they do exist, and it takes someone like you to go digging to find them. It is not readily available. So that's kind of the frustration, just being a person living in the United States and trying to do your best. Like you don't have the information, you can't do your best. It's all about informed consent, but again, you have to be informed. So, anyways, yeah, it's
I'm
important.
in full agreement.
Yeah.
I try to be a voice and try to, since my brain functions in the way of reading and translating research, like
Yeah.
be useful to the world and share that with others so they are more informed and can make better choices for their families as well. It's hard. Like the food environment is hard, grocery stores, so much of the stuff on the shelves is just not of great quality. You really have to kind of be a detective reading through ingredient lists. Like it does get tiring. And even I get tired, like with the, decision fatigue on what am I going to make for dinner? Like I would love to be able to go to the grocery store and just buy something pre-made off the shelf that's not full of crap. And it's really difficult at a regular grocery store anyways to do that. And ultimately it's like, okay, I'm going to have to make the choice to sacrifice my time and energy cooking up raw ingredients into a meal versus something packaged. Because anytime that I go and like, you know what, I'll just do a prepackaged whatever, we all feel like garbage, and when you're used to feeling pretty good, then when you go back to feeling like garbage, you're like, I don't want to feel like that. And so ultimately for me anyways, the sacrifice is in the time spent in the kitchen. Like you simply have to spend a little more time in the kitchen, but the rewards you reap, I believe, are worth it. And I do try to, in my recipes, there's a recipe section, meal plan section in all of my books, put together like pretty quick and relatively easy recipes, flavorful recipes that make it easy to actually translate this to what you're doing in the kitchen. I'm not here to, make some ridiculously complex, like 35-step recipe that takes 4 hours. Maybe on a holiday or something, I'll make a pie or something. But, on a day to day, we really need like meals on the table that have pretty low amount of prep time. And other than slow cooker meals, like slow, like not that much cooking time. You either got to do like the prep in the morning, or if you're using an instant pot or something, in a few minutes in the afternoon, or something that can come together in about 30 minutes for dinner time, because we're all strapped on time. Let's be real, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's awesome. Before you go, I just had a couple other questions. One of them had to do with dad's nutrition. So we talked a lot about nutrition today. Is everything that you're talking about just for women? Is it also for men, or how does it differ for the men, especially those that we are trying to create babies with?
So the good news is the vast majority carries over to men as well. Obviously, men need more food than women because they're larger typically. So you'll want to like scale up the portions that they might have. So if you're using any of the meal plans in Real Food for Fertility, your husband or partner could eat a similar meal, but they're probably going to want a larger portion. There are some like individual differences with certain supplements, for example, where we have like quite a bit of research on, zinc supplementation or selenium supplementation for improving sperm quality. But quite a few of the recommended supplements actually overlap for egg quality as well. I mean, we are all human biologically, and there are differences of course between the sexes, but nutritionally our needs are fairly similar. A lot of it has to do with the amount consumed. There may be some different like lifestyle choices that'll affect men and not women, so you have to think about like compression or overheating of the testes, which obviously is not a concern for women. So men riding bikes, having their laptop on their laps and that sort of thing is like more of a male specific consideration than it is a female issue. but a lot of overlap. So it doesn't have to be making separate meals for one partner versus the other. There's quite a bit that carries forward for both.
And then how about supplements? Because I know that's like a big hot topic, especially with women who are having issues with fertility or they're really trying to just get their body ready to be pregnant. We hear a lot about supplements. So, do you have some of your favorite recommended ones? Are they necessary? Can you get everything that you need from food? What are your thoughts on those?
Yeah, so I'm a food forward dietitian. I like to help people get as many of the nutrients as they possibly can from food. We have to remember, like, we don't know everything about nutrition. So there's nutrients in foods that we haven't even yet identified or given a name to yet, right? There might be some antioxidant that has not yet been named that has some miraculous effect on egg quality, but we don't know about it yet. So if we're eating whole foods, we're kind of checking the boxes for all the things we know and probably a lot of things we don't know. And we're also getting the synergy of nutrients that work together, nutrients that enhance the function of another nutrient. So, food first, of course. I am not anti supplementation. I think supplementation has a place, particularly because a lot of our foods are less nutrient dense than they once were, or there's a whole host of reasons that people are nutritionally depleted beyond just what might be depleted from the diet. There's medications that deplete us in certain nutrients. Hormonal birth control does that. Being exposed to a lot of toxins or having a lot of oxidative stress, our body is going to be expending extra nutritional resources to put out that inflammatory fire or to help optimize our detoxification systems. And as a whole, low nutrient intake is like surprisingly common. And it's not just something that affects only, third world countries and people with food scarcity. Like we see micronutrient deficiencies in about at least half of women, like across the board, when you're looking at all micronutrients, at least half of women have one or more micronutrient deficiencies. So if we take a comprehensive prenatal vitamin, we fill in any potential gaps that might be present. So I am a big fan of a comprehensive prenatal in the preconception, pregnancy, postpartum time. There are certain nutrients that we can very readily test for our nutrient status and then supplement when necessary. Vitamin D is like a really good example. Iodine is another one. Sometimes people need extra than what's in their diet or what's in their prenatal. Certain fatty acids like DHA, really vital for egg quality, sperm quality. Unless you're eating 12 ounces or more of high omega-3 seafood per week, you're probably not hitting the mark on omega-3s. And if you eat a whole lot of products that have seed oils and other things, or you've eaten kind of a processed food diet for a long time, you may simply be depleted in DHA. So that is something where supplementing with a high quality fish oil can help kind of fill in that gap. Or you have people who just like, I'm not going to eat seafood whatsoever, or maybe they don't eat animal foods whatsoever and they need like an algae-based DHA. Like there's a place for supplementation to kind of like individually fill in gaps in the diet. Then there's, all of those things can play some role in fertility alone, but there are some individual supplements that have been highly studied for certain fertility concerns like PCOS or poor egg quality, things like that. So there is a section, or actually it's a whole chapter in Real Food for Fertility on supplements that goes through all the different options, like the ones that I consider pretty essential, the ones that are a little more optional, and then some that I don't recommend that you supplement and instead optimize what's in your diet. And this is why. But to give you like a taste, like some of the optional supplements where you have like, pretty good data on why they might be important and helpful in certain instances. We have like CoQ10, alpha lipoic acid, both of those act as antioxidants. Inositol can be really, really helpful, especially for women with PCOS. N-acetylcysteine can help a variety of conditions, very helpful for liver detoxification. So we kind of go like supplement by supplement, which ones you might consider, where you get those nutrients or compounds in food and whether it's realistic for you to like optimize that through diet, and then like what sort of a dose is typically seen as effective in different situations.
Okay, so this has me questioning, like, because if it were me, where would I get this tested, or where would somebody get this tested, and with whom, so that the test results would be read in the proper way? Because I feel like a lot of times, and even for myself, right, you'd get the blood work and everything looks fine. Well, I still haven't conceived in, however long, or I'm having these issues, but everything looks fine. So do you have recommended providers or dietitians, or like who do you recommend that women go and see to have these things, figured out for them?
Yeah, it's so complicated, and navigating our healthcare system is just incredibly frustrating. So I'll share in that with the audience as well. It's so hard to say like who to go see because like some of the labs that we talk about, there's a whole chapter in lab tests, by the way, so you could see which ones we're suggesting you get. Some of these lab tests you can order through conventional providers. A lot of times there's more advanced testing that can give you a lot more information that you probably need to go to a specialist to get. And it depends on the training of that specialist. So I can't say like, oh, an endocrinologist or a fertility specialist or a reproductive endocrinologist or an OBGYN or a functional medicine practitioner. Like it all has to do with what their training is. Um, I do I run a practitioner training program, the Institute for Prenatal Nutrition. We cover lab tests in a lot of detail. And so we have a list of IPN graduates, graduate directory, and those would be practitioners who have been trained in them. Some of them, order lab tests in their practice. Some of them work in different areas of the industry where they might not be seeing private clients, but that could be a place where you could potentially inquire to see if there's one who could work with you. Or, just have a conversation if you're inquiring with a provider. We kind of arm you with the information of what lab tests to ask for. And when you inquire with them, you could say, hey, these are the types of things I'd like to get tested. Do you offer that in your office? And maybe that could save you the time of having like wasted time booking and waiting for an appointment only to not get very helpful, information at the end of it. It's a real struggle. It's a real struggle. Usually, like integrative or functional medicine practitioners have a little more training in ordering advanced lab work and more like looking at more functional or optimal ranges versus what the current reference ranges are. But again, it totally varies. I feel like there's so many providers that call themselves functional, and like what does that even mean? It's kind of been diluted in recent years, it seems.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I feel like I have a million more questions and we could talk for hours, but I won't do that to you or to everybody listening. But I do want everybody to know where they can connect with you and find you and all of that stuff. We list that here, and then I'll make sure it'll be in show notes. You guys will get it in the email this week if you're on the email list. But where can people reach you?
Yeah, so you can reach me on my main website, lilynicholsrdn.com. There's a tab for my books. You can find them there. We talked mostly about Real Food for Fertility today. We do have a website for the book. It's realfoodforfertility.com. On that site, you can download the first chapter for free. So if you want to like get a feel for the book, it's actually more than the first chapter. You get the intro and the foreword, which is written by Dr. Aviva Ram. So you get like a lot more info than just the first chapter, and you'll see the table of contents to see like the breadth of information that we cover in the book. It's pretty meaty. It's like 500 pages, 2,300 plus citations. So it's a meaty book, but we did really make an effort to make it as easy to read as possible. Back over on my main website, lilynicholsrdn.com, you have my blog. There's 250 plus articles on there. There's no paywall. It's all free. Lots of freebies on my site as well. So, take your pick, whatever you find most interesting. Use the search bar to search my site. Like the 5 fertility myths blog post would probably be interesting to a lot of people, especially if you're questioning the whole, like, you're recommending meat? I thought that was bad for fertility. Like, I address a lot of myths in that blog. As for social media, I'm most active on Instagram, and my handle is the same as my site. So it's Lily Nichols RDN.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If you loved what you heard today, the very best way to support this podcast and help other moms to find it is to leave a quick review. I read one at the beginning of the episodes, and I would love for yours to be next. And if you're ready for even more pregnancy, birth, and postpartum goodness, come join me in the My Essential Birth course at myessentialbirth.com, where I will hold your hand and walk you through pregnancy and birth step by step so you're totally prepared for a birth you'll love. See you next week.